Good evening, Tom. How are you this week?
I'm very well, Simon. Looking forward to speaking to you. How are you tonight?
Fantastic. Really good. And I'm so enjoying these daily episodes on Crime Time Inc. We're getting new listeners all the time. We really hit a seam out there for Crime Time Inc.'s growth. It seems to be working a treat. This week, they did a fantastic job, Tom. They started off with what I believe is the UK's worst ever serial killer. 212 murders accredited to one person. And of course, there's only one man we could be talking about there is Harold Shipman, who committed suicide back in 2004 in prison.
Beware, you should always caveat when you're talking about these things as that we know of. We know of.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, you boys were so slipshod through in the West during the 1980s. Goodness knows how many dead there really are.
It didn't take you long this week, did it?
No, it didn't take me long at all.
Have you been dreaming that up all week? Is that taking you a week
not,
to
Simon,
come up with?
But you know what? Simon? My new resolution is no more Mr. Nice Guy. No more Mr. Nice Guy.
I just hope you don't get Grandpa's joke book again this Christmas. I don't think I could bear that.
No, I mean, as you say, Harold Shipman, I remember it well. And Harold Shipman, apart from being the ultimate breach of trust, because that's what it was really, the trust to be placed in the medical profession. Of course, we've discussed some of the other issues around about nurses and things in previous episodes. And it's interesting because we're discussing now in the news as we speak is the assisted dying legislation and all the safeguards that have to be put in place to protect people from unscrupulous folk. And that's what Shipman was. Shipman, I don't think, to his dying day, and of course he killed himself in prison, I don't think Shipman believed he'd done any wrong. I think Shipman thought that he was almost like an angel of mercy, bringing an end to people who were ailing and in pain, and that's all very well and good, but then when you see that what he was actually doing, he was exploiting them for money.
Yeah.
I remember speaking to a GP friend of mine, and he said that it changed everything. The one thing it changed was that the little one-man practices were no longer considered safe, and health boards took a view as to the one-man practices. So these little GP's practices that had gone on for many years, ever since the NHS came in, long before the NHS in 1948, the checks and balances were not there. The trust had gone, and systems had to be put in place to make sure about prescribing and all the rest of it. So the admin increased, the poisons list, prescribing data were all put in place, and that was all because these were all consequences of Harold Shipman.
And helped to drag us into the 21st century, I suppose. I think my parents, Tom, and you'll maybe think this as well, it was absolutely unquestionable to question a doctor. A doctor was God as far as my parents and grandparents were concerned. If the doctor was coming to the house, it was a spring clean time before the doctor coming in the door. He was a god in a lot of ways. Do you think there's also an element of, you know when you get thefts from a workplace, and it generally works out that it started off with pilfering. Mm-hmm. It started off with a few shillings out the till, and nobody get caught, nobody even noticed. So then it becomes a regular occurrence, maybe at the weekends. And then it becomes they need a wee bit more and nobody's noticing. These things can upscale. I remember a case in Rossi I had where the woman had been stealing for 4 years and it amounted to £74,000 that she'd stolen when she eventually got caught for it. Do you think there's a bit of that with Shipman here, that once he'd done the first one, the first half dozen, it became pretty much routine for him that he thought he was invincible, it seems?
Yeah, and to some extent he probably was, but like all these people, he just went over the top. But coming back to what we're talking about, about breach of trust and positions of trust, I remember a few years ago speaking to somebody who was a local councillor for one of the small towns in West Lothian, and he said that in his lifetime, he could remember a time when there were genuine pillars of the community. There was the doctor, the banker, the lawyer, and the policeman. And now all these pillars had all been eroded and were either absent, not there at all, or had been devalued by people like Shipman. And they were present in every small town, and they were utterly trustworthy and beyond any kind of suspicion. You're absolutely right. When the doctor came, you would no more have thought of questioning the doctor or asking for a second opinion than fly in the air. They were, and a lot of them were family friends. They'd been the doctor for generations.
An integral part of the community. Tom, off the subject of that, I saw two cops yesterday in the street, and they're meant to be in uniform, but they're wearing totally different things. One's got a cap on, the other one's got nothing on. One had a high-vis jacket, the other didn't. One's got his hands in his pockets, slouching up the street, and the two of them are totally engrossed in whatever they're talking about, conversation they're having. They wouldn't have noticed anything round about them. And I think you said that trust and respect has been eroded. I think the police service are doing themselves a disservice in allowing people to erode that, because part of that respect was your stature, your uniform, and the way you presented yourself in public. That's what I was always taught.
That's right. I wrote a piece just last week for the 1919 magazine, reflecting on the Scottish Police College. I was remembering my first time I arrived there, this callow youths, really, when you think about it now, absolutely as green as grass. There was no drill sergeant there, Sergeant Duff.
Tom Duff. No
Glasgow.
way.
I think he was Glasgow City Police. But Tom Duff was determined to lick us into shape. And I remember him very early on saying to us, or barking at us more like, he didn't speak to anybody, he barked at you. And he said, if you look smart, people might make the mistake that you are smart. It'll give you an edge. And you know what? He was absolutely right. But that little tale you've told about the policemen walking down the streets, nowadays they can wear the cap or the baseball cap. That's entirely up to them. Going around without headgear is absolutely dangerous, because people don't seem to realise that under the Road Traffic Act, a constable in uniform has got to be wearing a hat.
Yep.
But the worst thing that you've told me about that story, and I've noticed it time again, they were speaking to each other.
Totally engrossed.
First thing I was taught was that you were walking down the street on the beat, you were speaking to the public. Your eyes were upwards, you were observing.
Say hello to people that pass by. And you could tell the nature of people as they pass by, because old ladies would love to say hello to the policeman, wouldn't they? And maybe think of something to say to you just for the sake of speaking.
Yeah, you were engaging, Simon. That's what you were doing.
Yes.
You were engaging. Let's not sound like two old cops that are saying that in our days everything was good, because we know very well it wasn't. Everything wasn't very good. But I do think the beatcraft and actually this business of walking, slouching around, talking to each other, I think they're missing so much, and they're making a big mistake.
What's your view about assisted dying then, Tom? You referred to it there because we're talking about Shipman, who had his own scheme on the go of assisted dying. What's your thoughts on it with the legislation that's been presented in this Parliament?
On balance, I think that there should be an assisted dying scheme. I remember listening to a radio broadcast by an old minister many years ago. His wife had died a long and lingering death with some horrible disease. I don't know what it was. But he said he was heartbroken that he could not extend the same mercy to his wife as he could to his dog. And that always struck me as being actually hitting the nail right on the head. But there would have to be really, really good safeguards. And that's the key to it.
That's what worries me, Tom, because you and I have both seen how ruthless families can be when it comes to inheritance, when it comes to wanting to get their money, get their paws on the money as quickly as possible. It's something that I think the general public could underestimate, but you and I would never underestimate, because we've seen it firsthand, just how sad it is.
Well, when it comes to stealing from old people and old people getting ripped off, unfortunately, start with the family and work out. I've seen that time and time again. It's heartbreaking. I'm pleased to note that you've got a solution to that, because you won't be in that position because you're spending all your money.
That's it.
Before you get to your dotage.
And we call that our ski holidays, SKI. Not because we're interested in the slightest in skiing, but because we're spending the kids' inheritance, one holiday at a time.
If you want to do that while you still have mental capacity, hurry up. That's all I'm saying. Hurry up.
I'm in a rush. Yeah, so Mr. Shipman took his own life, coward's way out, I suppose, but that's his prerogative. He ended his own life prematurely.
Yeah,
Because he was never getting out again.
Well, no, he couldn't have done it. But Harold Shipman was another one of these murders we've talked about before that had profound consequences, quite apart from the crime.
Yeah.
Because Harold Shipman changed everything in regard to the relationship with general practices and general practitioners. And the safeguards that were put in place to prevent another Harold Shipman have created an enormous administrative job for our doctors. And one of the reasons why it's so difficult to get a GP's appointment these days is because of the huge administrative task that's placed upon doctors and medical practices, not just doctors, but medical practices. And a lot of that comes via Harold Shipman. That was the other part of his dark legacy.
Something that most people are aware of, certainly that have lost parents, relatives, and their dealings with hospitals, there's already quite a sensitive approach to end-of-life experiences. What I'm thinking, first and foremost, we've seen it many times, is switching people off because they've gone into a vegetative state. There's a decision made that they could be kept alive for years and years and years, artificially on ventilators and whatnot. But there's a collective decision made by family and the medics to take the plug out. There's also, I was aware just this week of an old lady, she's 94, she's a friend of the family, and she had to go into hospital, she had a wee fall, but she must have told everybody 100 times, remember, no resuscitation, and she's left it in writing, that's her wishes. So there's already lots of things in place, and I know that when people get to the stage of palliative care, the medics take a step back and all they're doing is making people comfortable, giving them sufficient painkillers and medication.
A good friend of mine, unfortunately she's dead now, was a nurse who received her training down at the Middlesex Hospital in the 1950s. She was a very, very experienced nurse, and she said that during her training, they used to go around the wards and there would be old people who were struggling on. And there was a medicine that they would give called Brompton's Elixir. And Brompton's Elixir is basically liquid morphine. And as my friend, who was the young nurse, was going around with the senior staff nurse, she noticed that the senior staff nurse was giving quite liberal amounts of this Brompton's Elixir, more than was recommended. But at the end of the shift, what the old nurse was doing was easing the passage of these people. My friend said to her, "Oh, staff, nurse, these doses were beyond they were above the recommended dosage." And she said, "The quality of mercy is not measured in fluid ounces."
Yeah, and that's the truth. There's such big grey areas in there, isn't there?
Yeah.
But Shipman went right over the top and just got carried away. And as you say, there was a financial motive there because he was stealing as well.
If Harold Shipman had been easing the passage of people who were suffering, but some of his victims were not.
Yeah.
Some of his victims were lucrative targets. So let's not get sentimental or misty-eyed about Shipman. Shipman was an acquisitive criminal who was using his position of power in order to carry through criminal acts. So, and he did a huge amount to destroy the confidence.
A lot of the cases we're going to speak about tonight, Tom, were landmark cases. We talked about Ruxton, your book, The First Modern Murder, The World's End, all the things that changed because of these major inquiries, serial killers and whatnot. These cases tonight were like that in their own way too. They were landmark cases, and that's how the law grows and evolves over the years. Tom, before we move on, what did you think of our deep dive team with Shipman? I think they were quite excited by it, weren't they?
Very good. Yes, they're very good. I mean, I have to say I've been hugely impressed by the detail they go into and the facts they dig out. They've got an enormous range of research. Quite astonishing, really, but hugely impressive. It really is.
I think we should always be conscious that we're getting new listeners now. We're new listeners every day to Crime Time Inc. So just for their benefit, every single day of the week, we've got a short podcast done by our deep dive team here at Crime Time Inc. And on Sunday, we publish Tom and I's serialisation of that, if you like, when we talk about the issues that they've raised. during the course of that through the week. So, Tom, for those new listeners, and also, did you notice this week, I've missed it, it's been there for a while now, they were now on YouTube, and there's captions, you can see what's going on. If after tonight, when we've had a discussion, give me a call and I'll let you know what YouTube is, and put you in touch with that. But there's subtitles for your Edinburgh accent, it's got everything. And people aren't aware of that yet on YouTube, I don't think. But everything that we do here is replicated on YouTube, and all the episodes are there now, going back a year to episode 1 with George Barnsley when we started off this project. Have you had a look at the YouTube?
I have. In fact, I'm very familiar with YouTube through my younger members of my family, has got to be said. But yes, I am, and it's a super resource. And that's right. And I hope that more of our listening audience will catch on to that. It's good.
Good, Tom. Moving on, we've got the case of Emmett Till, 1955. It was a horrible case, wasn't it? It was so sad, but it told us so much about the culture, American culture in the South at that time.
Yeah, when I read it, I thought, this was, if it had said it was 1855,
yeah,
I would have believed it. The lynching of a young black boy towards a white woman, it sounds like something before the Civil War. I thought about the world as it presently is, where racial intolerance and religious intolerance is probably greater now than it's ever been. That it's been probably in our lifetime, Simon.
Yes.
When you think of the anti-Semitism there is, and we shouldn't be complacent. Things like this could still happen.
Yep. That's what I was thinking as well, Tom. Every time I think about human rights, it's a term that's bandied about. And people take these rights for granted, Tom, here in the West, here in the what we call civilised world, which is quite a strange term. And in a lot of countries throughout the world, and you've mentioned a few of them, people don't have any rights at all, and their lives are in very fragile hands. We see that all the time. But this case, 1955, you were saying that this could have been a 19th century case.
Yeah, pre-Civil War, but the big thing was the civil rights legislation passed by Lyndon Johnson in the early 60s. But from 1864, when Lincoln freed the slaves, you would have thought that kind of thing was on the decrease. But here we are, 1955.
Yeah. What I was thinking about was, we laughed about the Appin murder a couple of weeks ago when it was all Campbell's on the jury. This one met that when there was no conviction. They were found not guilty of the murder. We should maybe mention that he was down on holiday. He didn't even live in the South. He was only down on a family holiday and happened to speak to a woman in the shop, a white woman in the shop, inappropriately, although she later withdrew that allegation when it was far too late.
Yeah, I think that's right. The cultural differences. I think he came from Chicago, which of course was a big sprawling city, and you could probably get away with saying these things, but he was down in the Mississippi Delta where things were very different, old-fashioned. The allegation was that he made some inappropriate sexual remark to this white woman, and that was enough to get him lynched. Quite horrendous. And of course the jury thing, and that's why in many of these cases the federal authorities had to come in and do it, because the local police couldn't be trusted either, because they were all part of that same society.
And again, Tom, a landmark case, 1955. The legislation, the Racial Equalities Act came out in 1957. This changed everything, didn't it? Because of the photographs, because of the publicity that it got nationwide. There was big social changes made thereafter.
Yes, and it started a ball rolling which continued through to the civil rights legislation of Lyndon Johnson in the early 60s. The thing that struck me most about the Emmett Till case is that there is no room for complacency. With the world as it is just now, and intolerance rising more than falling, we shouldn't look back at Emmett Till and think what a historic anomaly that was. We should be very, very careful that these circumstances don't arise again.
Because we see hatred all over, and politically, some of these parties that are very right-wing and nationalist, they're gaining power now. They're rising throughout Europe.
Yep.
The next case was an older one, Tom, 100 years before. I think it's 1870s, of Mary Ann Cotton. And this was a British case. And I know that it's a subject that you're very interested in, because we've spoke about the Glasgow murder mile, and there was a poisoning case in there too that we covered quite recently. And this was a case of Mary Ann Cotton. But she was a serial killer. She's one of the first recorded female serial killers in the UK. And she took a lot of lives, although she was only convicted of one. What did you make of this?
I thought it was very interesting for two reasons. She was the original Black Widow who murdered her husbands and moved on to somebody else with money. And there's been a few of them, of course, using different means. The other thing, and what does interest me about this, is the use of arsenic poisoning. The use of poisoning, which if you look at methods, modus operandi, you'll see from the 1830s through the 1870s, 1880s, it was a preferred method of murder. It was poisoning generally, and arsenic in particular, because it didn't leave any traces and freely available. And you could buy arsenic over the counter for different purposes. Mary Ann Cotton was one of the cases that brought in the Poisons Acts, which actually prescribed and controlled the use of poisons and the purchase of poisons. And now, quite rightly, you cannot buy arsenic or any of these deadly poisons at all unless you've got a special licence. So it was interesting for a couple of reasons.
Yeah, and it was so prevalent, part of the defence strategy, because she fought it and appealed it as well, because she was sentenced to death. Part of the defence strategy was to say that the wallpaper in the house, the green wallpaper, had traces of arsenic in it because it was one of the ingredients used to make that colour. It was all about, as I would imagine, the same as lead poisoning in those days, Tom. We didn't know anything about it, but it was killing people left, right and centre.
Yeah, that's right. But arsenic was used in quite a lot of common household potions. It was used widely.
Did she not say that she tried to kill bed lice with it?
But you could buy it. You could buy it for killing vermin, for mice and rats and stuff like that.
And husbands.
And husbands. And Simon, let that be a lesson to you, my boy.
But she got a bit cocky. Again, it was the stealing the small change out the till, and things just went a bit far. Because she ended up telling family members, stepchildren, all sorts of things. If you said the wrong thing, or didn't eat your whole dinner or something, then you were in line for the chocolate.
Well, that's right. That's the trouble. They give themselves away eventually. Thank goodness for it. Mary Ann Cotton.
Good case and a good coverage from dive team. The final one I know that you are interested in, I'm not sure if you wrote about Peter Manuel or had some involvement in it, Tom. I can't remember, but I know we've spoke about it before. What did you think, firstly, of the deep dive team's coverage of it?
Thought it was very good, as always, very well researched, all the data there. Manuel interests me. Manuel was long before my time, but funnily enough, I've got several connections with the Manuel case. His last defence lawyer, because he sacked him and decided to defend himself eventually, was a man called Harold Leslie, who became Lord Bursey. When I was a wee boy, I knew him. He was a friend of my parents, and I met Harold Leslie, who was a lovely gentleman, and it was he who tried to defend Peter Manuel. The thing that strikes me about Peter Manuel is that I think he was a supreme egotist. He was a criminal, he was a housebreaker, but I think also he liked to think he was smarter than the police, and he was almost taunting the police, particularly Munsey, who was the head of Lanarkshire CID at that time. Peter Manuel was almost taunting him in terms of his criminality. On a lesser scale, back in the 90s, we had a very clever fellow in Lothian who was a fraudster. He took great pleasure in trying to outwit the police. And he became a police informant, but he wasn't an informant at all. What he was doing was he was giving information to lead the police astray. He was a corrupt informant, and which led to all sorts of trouble for us in the 1990s. It always struck me that I'm not going to name him, he's dead, but I'm not going to name him because I don't want to bring him any more credit. But it struck me that he was a very similar man to Peter Manuel, a man who thought he was smarter than the average bear, and certainly smarter than the average detective. In Manuel's case, he ended up on the gallows. And of course, there's a very famous stated case, HMA versus Manuel, which we learned detective training, and that is all about the cautions and how if someone leads you to the scene of a crime or the recovery of vital evidence, even if they have not been cautioned, then that evidence may be permissible. And that was a very, very important stated case in Scots law.
Yeah, very much so. And it's something I spoke to you about recently the other night with Confession that I was watching on television. I've not seen the end of it yet, but it's something that we'll maybe ask the deep dive team to have a look at, because these issues inform what happens today when people are arrested.
The Manuel case, or HMA v Manuel, decided that in Scots law, that if there were circumstances which were very similar to what you're describing in the film Confession, very, very similar, if somebody takes you to see a crime, and Manuel actually took detectives and showed them where a body lay, and the body was found there, even though he had not been cautioned, it was of such importance that it should be admitted as evidence. And that was a very important decision in Scots law, but it was not binding in England.
Tom, we've mentioned a few things there that maybe our listeners would be wondering what we're talking. You threw in a word there, the caution. Let's just, because it's something that comes up all the time in every cop show that's ever been shown on television, is whether it's American, who've got a different caution. Let's explain a wee bit about, in Scots law, the purpose of the caution, when it's used by the police, and how it affects the evidence that's gathered thereafter, what its purpose is. Do you want to do that?
Yeah, I can do that. Funnily enough, in America, you'll hear references to an American cop show as Miranda. Miranda, this has been Miranda. And the Miranda case was the equivalent of the Manuel case. It's put there as a protection to stop people incriminating themselves. And the common law caution, as we all know, said that you're not obliged to say anything. But I'm sure you've been given the caution a few times, Simon. I don't have to tell you. You'll have been receiving the end of it a couple of times if I'm not too much mistaken.
Usually by my boss.
Exactly, yeah. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken and noted and maybe used in evidence. Now, in England, in the old days, they used to say against you. We don't say that now. We just say taken and noted and maybe used in evidence.
And we introduced recorded as well, didn't we, in the early 80s because of tape recording and stuff like that.
Well, that was all to do with the Criminal Justice Scotland Act. Yes. That's a recording, videoing, 6 hours detention. All of these safeguards, which I remember as a detective, we thought it was the end of the world. Yeah. But actually, it wasn't. Actually, what it did was it led us to do our job more professionally and actually plan the interviews. And they were much more successful as a consequence of that.
So let's dig a wee bit deeper for our listeners, Tom. When would a police officer, Miranda, let's stick with the UK, when should a police officer caution someone? If a police officer says to you, what are you doing there? What's your name? Why are you hanging about here?
Immediately you suspect them of being responsible for a crime. So if you're interviewing someone as a witness in a case and you suspect, or you have reason to suspect, or, reasonable grounds to suspect that someone may have committed the crime, then you should caution them.
Yeah, because after you've done that, you can note, you've said to him, then you can write down what he says.
Yes,
and
right.
That can be led as evidence because he was told he wasn't obliged to answer you.
That's right. Not obliged to say anything.
Yeah.
That's right.
And then you move to the position, as soon as you've got enough to charge him, you charge him. And again, you warn him that he's not obliged to say anything, and you tell him what he's charged with, and he makes a reply to that charge, and you write it down verbatim.
You can verbally charge him, but remember, and it's important in Scotland to remember this, that the only people who can bring a prosecution is the Lord Advocate, who prosecutes all crime in the public interest through his or her servants, who are the procurators fiscal.
When I give my evidence in court, it's admissible evidence for me to tell the court what was said under caution and when he was charged what his reply was. Because as soon as he's made that reply and I've noted it, then I can't speak to him about the case anymore.
Right.
Then he's got protections in place. So it's all about what can be led in court. That's really the purpose of it all.
It's all about fairness to the accused. I've heard a lot of policemen complain about it. Actually, remember that one day you might be pleased to have that protection yourself. And I remember there's a great quote from the great Thomas More, St. Thomas, who of course was persecuted and eventually executed for heresy by Henry VIII. He talked about the laws of protection for suspects as being like trees in a forest. If you cut them all down, where are you going to hide when the devil chases you?
Yeah,
it's right.
good.
It's right enough.
I was going to tell you what a QC told me once. Lewis Kennedy, in fact, a friend now, told me that most cases and convictions were sealed in the first 30 seconds of the police speaking to the suspect because they couldn't keep their mouth shut. And you and I both know how true that is.
Yeah,
Some of them just couldn't resist telling you everything.
That's right. That's right.
No matter how many, and they would say, I'm saying nothing. 2 minutes later, they've told you everything.
I remember being involved in a case where there had been salmon, poached salmon. The way it was when poached salmon were recovered on the banks of the river. This is not poached as in cooked. This is poached as in caught for you city boys.
Yeah.
They used to be taken to the police station and put in the fridge. And the commissioners for the river, the bailiffs, were contacted. And the bailiffs usually said that the fish had to be disposed of. And of course that meant it was cut up and people ate it. It was fine.
And poached.
Poached.
Poached again.
Pinched. So anyway, there was a complaint. There had been a fallout in the police station and somebody had shot somebody for taking this salmon. And I was a young sergeant and I went with a very old wise inspector down to sort this out. And it's the last place he wanted to be with this enemy. So we interviewed all these young cops. They were just young county policemen who were desperate to speak. And Drew Scott, the inspector, a lovely man, he's long dead now. They would say, well, I want to tell you, you're not obliged to say anything. But anything you do say, you're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say, no, you're not obliged to say
Oh dear. They used to say that DOs were the worst possible when you interviewed them. They just couldn't shut up.
Yeah.
What do you think of Manuel defending himself, Tom? You must have, like me, you must have came across that a few times in your career. And it was sometimes quite funny as well.
Well, it was, but I mean, that was another example where he thought he was smarter than everybody else. He thought he was smarter than the QCs. He thought he was smarter than the judge. He was arrogant, overconfident, and he ended up dying as a consequence. And I think that was his whole personality. And people have written long books and theses about Manuel. But for me, Manuel was just this arrogant man who had a vastly overinflated opinion of himself, who thought he was a match for anybody and set about antagonising the authorities almost to draw attention to himself. I would say, look at me, look at me, look at me. You can't catch me, you can't catch me, you can't catch me.
Real arrogance.
And there's one other connection, an interesting connection. The judge in the Manuel case was Lord Cameron, the famous Jock Cameron, one of the most famous 20th century Scottish judges. And Jock Cameron was the young Home Advocate Depute in the Ruxton case in 1935. There's the connection.
It's all joined up, Tom. I love these connections, Tom, and they seem to weave their way through everything that we do in every walk of life, but especially in crime. Things are all joined up. There's an old saying that you only have to go 7 levels deep in your associations and you'll start to find common links among each other. But the next case we're going to look at, you'd think at the face of it, there wouldn't be any links because it's across the water, it's American. This Barker Karpis case, Tom, is there a link there that you're going to surprise me with?
I am, Simon. I am indeed. This is a very, very interesting case. And in some senses, it was also a turning point in the American justice system. But there's another issue about Barker Karpis. And that's this business, and it struck me very forcibly, about this issue about celebrity criminals. And in the 1930s, 1920s and 30s, at exactly the same time as the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl in America, you had all these people who were basically just criminals, robbers, like John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, the Barker gang, Bonnie and Clyde, and of course Al Capone, all these people. And they seemed to, something to do with the social conditions at the time, they seem to achieve as kind of an almost a Robin Hood-like imagined sort of character. It's interesting that it's at these times of social hardship that you get this, where criminals are glorified. And you've had your share of that in Glasgow too, the sort of Glasgow gangster noir. And I think that's a very interesting point, something we should maybe dig into deeper later.
Yeah, I think you're right, Tom. There's a few issues in there that needs a bit of unpacking. We'll need to give it some thought and maybe get the team to have a look at that particular aspect of it. I'm thinking it's interesting that it's during times of depression in this case, but in times of hardship. And it's a kind of, I think it's a kind of finger up at the establishment, anyone that can buck the establishment who become the enemy at these times. And then they get romanticized by the press and the media, of course. Every case that you've just mentioned, they've got nicknames. They've got pictures, romanticized pictures. There's been movies made about them. There's been, dare I say, podcasts made about them. But there's a kind of hero worship going on, which is a bit strange. And the police are always the bad guys, aren't they?
That's right. Thinking it through, I mean, Johnny Rumensky, that we've spoken about on this podcast, and is a subject which I like to research, and gentle Johnny Rumensky, he was in that mode. He was a sort of folk hero, almost Robin Hood figure, although there was no suggestion he ever gave any money to anybody else but himself. He lost it all in the bookies. But there is an issue there, which I think we should look at carefully. Now, that was the thing that always used to annoy me, and we've spoken a lot about drugs, and I know you and I have got slightly different views on some of the issues around about drugs. But I always thought that your local neighbourhood drug dealer, although I accept that if you take them down as we did by the dozen, all you were doing was creating a gap in the market, somebody else come in, supply and demand. I understand all that. But the other factor about your local neighbourhood drug dealer is they very often set a terrible example to young people, because they were the guys in the blacked out BMWs with the jet ski in the drive. And I often thought, for that reason, if no other, they're worthy of attention. Because they're not just drug dealers, of course, they're multi-commodity criminals. But casting criminals as heroes, I think, is dangerous. And who knows what it leads on to? Who knows how many other young men and young women want to follow in their path? But coming back to Barker Karpis, very well organised, which is unusual. Because most of these gangs were pretty ramshackle. They weren't. They were very tight, very well organised. But what was really significant about it, and this is the connection, it was one of the first cases in 1932 that was proved by a fingerprint. Now, the FBI at that time, under J. Edgar Hoover, was desperate to try and advance scientific methods. And he was trying to do everything he could to push fingerprints forward as being a credible scientific method. Of course, fingerprints have been around since 1890, but they'd always been a wee bit suspected. The Barker Karpis case was one of the cases, very early cases in the States, where a single fingerprint, really came to the fore. Now, of course, the connection is that J. Edgar Hoover was very well connected with Percy Sillitoe. They met at a Chicago crime conference in 1934. They were both officers who wanted to advance science within criminal investigation. And of course, whereas the Barker Karpis case was J. Edgar Hoover's big chance to do that, it was the Ruxton case that was Percy Sillitoe's big chance to do that. So that's the connection.
Very good, Tom. With only 3 years between them. I should say for our listeners at Crime Time Inc. that we've covered Percy Sillitoe because you're quite an authority on Percy. And when we first met, you opened my eyes to the history connected with Percy Sillitoe, regarded as Glasgow's, if not Scotland's, greatest ever police officer. So I'd recommend anyone that's listening to this to look back at our back catalogue. And there's 2 episodes specifically about who we consider to be the James Bond of Scottish policing. It really was a great story. And we'll touch upon it time and time again, because these issues come up time and time again, and these turning points. You can see why J. Edgar Hoover and Percy Sillitoe got along anyway, with their common thoughts there. Tom, you referred to Glasgow and crime gangs and things like that there, and I know that you were being serious because it's a real problem through here in the West. In my time in the 80s especially, in the police, There was lots of robberies. We've discussed that before. The crime profile was different then because technology was different. Guns were more prevalent, armed robberies and whatnot, and cash was moving about the country on a daily basis with the post office, with people were paid in cash in those days. There'll be people listening to this that don't believe me, but it's true. I was wondering about crime families because we had our fair share of them through here in the West. Where these families, and sometimes there was a few hangers-on who became almost part of the family, but the hierarchy of the families, and I'm not going to name them on here because anyone in the west of Scotland has heard enough of them in the newspapers without me joining that chorus. But these guys stuck together because they could trust family, they could trust each other, and they built their own dynasties in their own areas. We've discussed the ice cream wars, which was very much like that. It was family orientated and controlled. What is your experience of that through in Edinburgh? Did you have similar profile of crime gangs through there?
Yeah, we had several criminal families. They weren't as large or as organised as through in your neck of the woods, but they were almost like dynasties. And so, you know, I bet you I could speak to a police officer who's working in the old areas that I worked in today, and the names would be familiar because the grandsons and great-grandsons and nephews will still be doing exactly what their family has always done. So yes, we did have them, but it tended to be fathers and sons and uncles, but in fairness, in a much smaller number than you had in the West. And that's something to do with the fact that Glasgow was an old industrial city. So you get the same thing happening in London, Manchester, Liverpool, Belfast, Glasgow. They've all got one thing in common. They're all heavy industrial cities. And of course, from the post-war times, they have been in decline. And it's that post-industrial decline that nurtures that kind of organised crime.
Yep. It's we've spoke before on here about grudging respect sometimes for criminals, which might seem strange to some of our listeners, but it's a real phenomenon in the police. In one case that I remember, it was actually the biggest robbery, armed bank robbery in Scotland at the time. We're nowhere near it now, but it was carried out in Barhead, just south of Glasgow. I'm not going to name him, but we got very, very close to nailing him for it. And it transpired that this guy had been doing one robbery a year, Tom. That's all he did. And we knew by the end of this inquiry exactly what he'd been doing. And he cased the place for months. He was a runner. He loved jogging. And we could show that he'd been out jogging in the area. Although cased the joint to the nth degree. And it had no particular MO other than he left very little behind. I'll give you an example that he wore plastic bags, sellotaped onto his shins to protect him leaving footprints behind. So he was very thorough. He was in his 60s at that time. He's probably long gone now. I would imagine he will be. But the reason I'm telling you about it is because we tracked his family down. And it was daughters. He had 2 daughters from memory and a son. And we tracked them down as well as his own address, obviously. And they were all living in the lap of luxury. Nobody worked a day in their life. Nobody had ever lifted a finger. And their houses were palatial. Not in the best districts in the West, but certainly palatial in comparison with their surroundings. And you knew immediately that you started speaking to them that they were never going to say anything to you at all. They were just so wrapped up in his career. He was a career criminal, and he kept his family in luxury and kept his head below the radar the whole time. Only surfaced once a year, and this was the first time we had got close to him.
Yeah, we had one or two like that, and I've written about one of ours, Hugh Kelly Mannion, who broke into prison, and he was a guy just like that, who planned. And I remember speaking to someone who was in his circle, and Hugh Mannion he's dead now, but Hugh Mannion was absolutely infuriated when the Great Train Robbery took place. Not infuriated that robbery had taken place, but infuriated that the gang had made such a mess of it and had left so many forensic clues at Letherslade Farm, which of course caught them all. It was the fact that it was such a ripe target and they'd made such a mess of it really offended against his professional pride.
So to finish with the Barker Karpis gang, were you a Boney M fan?
Baker, Barker. Well, that just shows you, isn't it? Even into our youth. I mean, that case is almost 100 years ago. even into our youth, the name was still coming up and still being romanticised. But the thing we should remember the Barker Karpis gang for is not that. It was because it was one of the flagship cases for the advancement of forensic science and fingerprints. That's the point.
Brilliant, Tom. And our final case this week that the team had a deep dive into, as they call it, was the Murders. Were you aware of that at the time? Because that's much more recent, of course. It's in the last 3 or 4 years, isn't it?
I'd heard about it, but to be honest, I didn't become really interested in it because it was almost like a celebrity crime. They were rich and famous and all the rest of it. And I think about these things as sometimes there's a prurient interest taken in these cases because of just the fact they were rich and famous, and the celebrity aspect of it. But quite clearly, they were a hugely successful family, but beneath the surface, there were a bunch of rogues, the whole lot of them. You could see that from the cases that unfolds. An incredibly complicated case of families stabbing each other in the back. But it's had a huge amount of coverage on it. But for me, it struck me the fact that it was the interesting issue was that with the celebrity point, they had really no reason to commit the crime that they did. They could have lived very, very well behaving honestly, but they couldn't.
It seems to be a theme with that type of crime, Tom. We've seen it so many times. People who, in fact, we relied on it through here with some major index criminals who get caught for the stupidest things. They get caught resetting a stolen television or being involved in a stupid fraud, providing premises or whatever, when they had no need to. They were made for life. They had businesses. Dare I say they were respectable business people as far as their communities were concerned, although the police knew where they had started and about their criminal past. But it's that one word that catches people out time and time again, and it's greed, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's right, but it's an interesting tactic, isn't it? I mean, famously, Al Capone was brought down, not for murder or for racketeering, but for tax evasion. And very famously, when Percy Sillitoe came to Glasgow and was trying to deal with the gangs, he adopted a very similar tactic. And one of the major gang leaders of the Billy Boys gang was actually arrested for being drunk in charge of a child under 7. But the point is, you see, as you and I both know, that gets them off the streets. And once they're off the streets, everything falls apart.
Yeah. Because you can then speak to the associates. You're too scared to speak when they're on the streets, if you like. So it's a game changer when you can get them into a cell, that's for sure. Great stuff, Tom. I've enjoyed it this week. I'm looking forward already to next week's episode starting on Monday, tomorrow. In the meantime, I've got loads to do. I've just got my visa approval for going to Australia in January.
I was thinking about your trip to Australia, Simon. You're really unlucky. You're an unlucky guy because here you're paying thousands and thousands of pounds to go to Australia. If you'd just lived 200 years ago, you'd have been sent for free.
The one-way ticket, Tom. Tom, great stuff. We will speak next week, and we've got 6 new cases in the pipeline for Crime Time Inc., our daily podcast. Looking forward to it. Have you got much planned between now and then?
Yeah, I'm very busy. I've got a lot doing. I've got a book on the bombing of Edinburgh and Leith coming out. It's being proofed at the moment, so it'll be out at the beginning of the year. So as you know, with a book, the last final checks to make sure everything is right are hugely important. So that's what I'll be doing.
Yeah, it's a scary thought pressing the button to say send it to the printer.
I know, because then you have a second thought.
And I suppose we've got big news today, Tom, that I'll know a wee bit more about next week, hopefully. But we have a date for our next live show of Crime Time Inc.
That's right, and it's not too far away.
No, March the 13th, a Thursday night in Glasgow. But we'll give the details later.
That's tremendous, Simon. Listen, you have a nice weekend and speak next week.
Cheers, Tom. Bye.